Welcome to the Paul Adefarasin podcast. We revisit the word, surface the big ideas, and give you space to reflect, pray, and act. If you'd like the full message, though, you can watch it on YouTube or listen on Spotify after this episode.
What if the biggest barrier to your financial stability wasn't the broader economy,
Right.
or, your career path, but what if it was actually a centuries-old theological misunderstanding?
Honestly, that is such a wild concept to wrap your head around.
It really is. Today, we're taking a deep dive into this idea that poverty somehow equals piety.
Yeah, it's a deeply ingrained belief, isn't it?
Yeah.
For generations, these cultural and religious narratives have basically implied that being financially broke makes you, spiritually pure.
Exactly. And that acquiring wealth is just inherently selfish or corrupting.
Which is such a heavy burden to put on people who are just trying to survive.
Right. And that is the exact orthodoxy being totally dismantled in our deep dive today.
I'm really excited for this one.
Me too. We are unpacking this incredibly dynamic sermon by Pastor Paul Adefarasin. He delivered it at the House on the Rock Church.
Yeah, and the title alone is a statement. Escaping the curse of poverty to enter the life that God has intended.
It sets the tone immediately. So our mission for you today is to extract the core message here, highlight the actual scriptures he relies on, and pull out the practical, actionable habits he challenges the congregation to adopt.
Because he's really presenting a framework that treats wealth as a completely neutral tool, right? A tool meant for massive societal transformation.
Spot on. But before we get into the heavy theology, we have to talk about the setting, because the vibe of this source material is so important.
Oh, totally. House on the Rock is this vibrant, deeply culturally engaged congregation.
Yeah, you can hear it in the audio.
Exactly. The pastor isn't standing at a podium delivering some somber, dusty academic lecture in a quiet room.
No, he's actively engaging with the audience. I mean, he's playfully shouting out Arsenal football fans before jumping into these massive theological concepts.
Right, which just shows he's talking to regular people operating the real world.
So let's start with the ideological battleground he sets up. Because before he even touches on how to acquire money, he entirely redefines poverty itself.
This was fascinating.
He calls poverty a satanic lie, and basically a psychological assault on the mind.
A psychological assault. That really reframes it.
Yeah, his premise is that the battle against poverty isn't even financial at first. It's almost entirely mental.
Which, if you look at the psychology of belief systems, makes perfect sense.
Oh, how so?
Well, a society creates its own orthodoxies,
Right.
right? These are concepts we rehearse so consistently and absorb so slowly that they just completely bypass our critical thinking.
They just become the water we swim in.
Exactly. They stop feeling like constructed beliefs and start feeling like the unavoidable state of the universe.
And to explain how that psychological conditioning happens, the sermon uses this great metaphor, essentially the boiling frog concept.
Oh, right, where the frog doesn't jump out of the pot because the heat is turned up so slowly.
Yeah, exactly. He points to the slow, silent erosion of purchasing power as the heat in the pot. He uses the Nigerian naira as a specific example for his congregation.
I remember this part. It's a stark comparison.
It really is. He notes that 50 years ago, one naira bought nearly $3.
Wow.
Right. And you fast forward to today, and that currency has plummeted to roughly 1,800 naira to a single dollar.
That is just a staggering drop.
Mm-hmm.
And that slow erosion is the perfect mechanism for conditioning a population, like we were saying.
Because it happens over decades.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When economic decline happens incrementally like that, a society simply adapts its baseline expectations downward.
You just get used to it.
You do. The mind absorbs this environment of constantly struggling, of just barely scraping by, and starts calling it normal.
So the real tragedy he's highlighting is that the psychological mindset of lack takes root in your brain long before your bank account is actually empty.
It's basically inflation applied to human ambition.
Ooh, that's a great way to put it. You just lower your sights year after year.
But the pastor offers this massive paradigm shift to break that hypnosis, right?
Yes, he does. He argues that the goal isn't actually to go out and just chase money.
Which sounds counterintuitive for a sermon about escaping poverty.
Right, but he states it so bluntly, he literally says God doesn't handle cash.
I love that line.
Instead, believers are instructed to chase value. You are supposed to build internalized personal value.
And the idea is that when you do that, wealth inevitably chases you.
Exactly. And the economics of that are pretty sound, aren't they?
Absolutely. Capital naturally flows toward solutions.
Right.
When you become someone who solves complex problems or, you offer something the market genuinely needs, you literally become a magnet for resources.
So the focus completely shifts from how do I get rich to how do I become deeply useful.
Which is a much more empowering question to ask yourself anyway.
But I want to test that logic for a second, because looking at the source material, there's this glaring question that comes up.
Okay, let's hear it.
Well, if wealth is so good, right, and
Yeah.
creating value is the metric, then why do we see so many blatantly corrupt people like slumlords, unethical politicians, just hoarding massive amounts of the world's wealth?
Yeah, it's the classic problem. The bad guys seem to be winning the financial game.
Exactly. If the design is for righteous people to prosper, what is going on there?
Well, the sermon actually anticipates that exact pushback. It's not ignoring reality.
Okay, how does he tackle it?
He uses Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 26, and Proverbs 13.22.
Right.
The biblical perspective he presents is that the wicked are essentially functioning as unconscious aggregators.
Unconscious aggregators, meaning they're just piling it up.
Exactly. They are stockpiling all this wealth, but they lack the actual spiritual and structural integrity to steward it across generations.
So it's not permanently theirs.
Right. The text argues this wealth is basically in a temporary holding pattern. It's meant to eventually be transferred to the righteous.
So wait, corrupt individuals are just doing the heavy lifting of gathering capital, but the system is ultimately designed to reroute it.
According to this theological framework, yes, absolutely.
That is wild.
The reason the current disparity exists is that a righteous generation needs to actually mature and build the structural vehicles to collect that wealth.
Vehicles meaning like what? Businesses?
Yeah, transparent corporations, ethical institutions, efficient distribution systems. Capital needs a secure, functioning runway to land on.
And until the righteous build those runways, the wealth just sits in the vaults of the corrupt.
Exactly. The system is waiting for competent stewards.
Man, that reframing totally changes the objective. You go from just sitting around complaining about the wealthy to actively needing to build better systems to displace them.
It's a call to action.
But, to even get people to want to build those systems, he has to systematically debunk this deeply ingrained vow of poverty we talked about.
Right, because if you think wealth is evil, you won't build a runway.
Exactly. So he goes deep into Scripture to prove that God fundamentally desires believers to operate from a position of abundance. Let's look at the foundational texts he brings up for this.
The text provides a very deliberate blueprint here. He starts with Proverbs 10.22 as a primary anchor.
The blessing of the Lord brings wealth, and he adds no trouble to it.
Right, and the emphasis in the sermon is on the word blessing as a singular noun.
Oh, the blessing. Capital T, capital B.
Yes, it refers to the self-existent nature of God himself, rather than a plural list of material items.
So the wealth is just a natural byproduct of that central relationship.
Precisely. And then he pairs that with Deuteronomy 8.1,
which emphasizes that God gives the power to get wealth specifically to establish his covenant.
not just to be rich for the sake of it.
Right. And he also brings in 3 John 1.2, which explicitly states a divine desire for the believer to prosper and be in health.
The biblical data he presents points entirely toward provision and abundance.
So how did we get so far away from that?
Well, the historical context here is critical. The pastor critiques how modern religious thought got infected by Greco-Roman philosophical traditions.
Oh, okay.
Think of like Greek asceticism or certain Roman philosophical schools. They completely idealized poverty and celibacy as the highest, purest spiritual paths.
Right, because they viewed the physical world as dirty and fallen, and only the spiritual world is clean.
Exactly. It's a dualistic worldview.
That is a massive divergence from the Eastern and Jewish biblical worldview that the original texts were actually written in.
Completely different paradigms.
Because in those ancient Eastern cultures, material abundance like fruitful harvests, physical provision, that was seen as tangible, undeniable evidence of God's blessing.
Yeah, the physical and spiritual weren't at war with each other. The physical reflected the spiritual.
Okay, but this is where we hit the inevitable counter-argument. You knew it was coming,
Let me guess.
Timothy.
Yep. Whenever you discuss wealth in a theological setting, someone is going to immediately quote 1 Timothy 6.1, the famous money is the root of all evil verse.
It's the ultimate trump card for poverty theology.
Right. So how does the sermon navigate that apparent contradiction. Proverbs offering wealth and Timothy seemingly condemning it,
The pastor's rebuttal is great because it relies on reading the actual words on the page rather than relying on the cultural paraphrase.
which we all tend to do.
Right. 1 Timothy 6.9 does not say money is the root of all evil. It says the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil.
Exactly. The sermon makes it explicitly clear that money itself is an entirely neutral instrument.
It's just paper or digits on a screen.
Yeah. It just acts as an amplifier for whatever's already in the heart of the person holding it.
I think you compared it earlier to a tool in a craftsman.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a hammer. A hammer can frame a house to shelter a family, or it can be used to shatter a window.
The hammer has no morality.
None at all. And furthermore, the sermon addresses that other famous warning, the one about serving God and mammon.
Right. You can't serve two masters. You'll love one and hate the other.
Yes, but the clarification he makes here is so important. Mammon, or mammonas in the original language, is not merely a synonym for cash or currency.
Oh, it's not.
No, it's a specific, demonic personification of greed, avarice, and ill-gotten gain. It is literally an idol demanding worship.
Okay, that changes things.
Right. The text asserts you absolutely cannot serve the psychological master of greed and the true God simultaneously.
That makes perfect sense.
But, and here's the kicker, you are actively required to use neutral currency to execute God's purposes in the physical world.
You can't just opt out of the economy.
Exactly. You have to use the tool.
To hammer home just how fundamental this neutral, abundant provision is to the human story, the pastor does this fascinating breakdown of the book of Genesis.
The 4 P's of gold.
Yes. The first mentions of gold in the Bible, I found this to be an incredibly elegant way to trace the narrative arc of wealth.
It really is. Let's follow that arc for a second.
Yeah.
Where does he say it begins?
The first P is providence, and it starts all the way back in Genesis chapter 2.
Right at the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, there is gold explicitly mentioned in the Garden of Eden. And the profound point he makes here is that this gold existed before Adam even had a reason to buy anything.
Commerce hadn't even been invented yet?
Human labor hadn't even begun. The gold was provided by God purely as an adornment, just a luxury of the natural environment.
So it normalizes wealth right at the dawn of the human story.
Exactly. It establishes that abundance was the baseline, original design.
Not some post-fall corruption.
Right. The corruption happens later in how humans relate to the gold, not in the gold itself.
That makes a lot of sense. So what's the next stage?
The narrative shifts to the second P, which is possession.
Okay. Possession.
Fast forward to Genesis chapter 13. The text describes Abraham as being very rich in cattle, silver, and gold.
And this wasn't just like enough money to buy extra bread for his family.
Not at all. It was a literal war chest. He used his substantial wealth to fund a private army to rescue his nephew Lot from an invading coalition of kings.
Okay, so in this stage, we see wealth transition. It goes from a natural environmental luxury into a strategic mechanism for defense and justice.
It becomes a tool to enforce a righteous outcome in a really hostile world.
Wow. And the third P.
The third P is proof. In Genesis 24, Abraham sends his trusted servant to find a wife for his son Isaac.
Right. The story at the well with Rebecca.
Exactly. When the servant encounters Rebecca, he doesn't just deliver a persuasive speech about how great Abraham's God is.
He hands her heavy, pure gold jewelry, bracelets and earrings.
Yeah, the gold functions as the visible metric of an invisible reality.
It's the material data that verifies the spiritual claim he's making.
Exactly. The wealth is the undeniable proof of God's backing on Abraham's family, which validates the servant's words.
That is so interesting, and it leads perfectly to the fourth P.
Provision, found in Genesis 41.
Joseph's story.
Right. Joseph is elevated from a foreign prisoner to the second in command of the entire Egyptian empire.
And Pharaoh literally removes his signet ring and places a gold chain around Joseph's neck.
And that gold wasn't just ceremonial jewelry, right? It represented absolute geopolitical authority. It was the massive resources Joseph required to steward the macroeconomic system of Egypt.
Because he used that wealth to save the known world from a devastating famine.
Exactly. So when you lay out providence, possession, proof, and provision sequentially like that,
it just completely dismantles the poverty theology.
it really does. You watch wealth evolve from a natural provision in an uncorrupted garden into a tool for localized justice, then a metric of divine backing, and finally a highly strategic instrument for global salvation and economic stewardship.
It's a brilliant progression.
Okay, so the ideological foundation is completely set. We understand the theology, and we recognize the necessity of creating personal value to attract resources.
But theology without application is just philosophy, right?
Exactly. And the brilliance of this sermon is that it doesn't leave you floating in the clouds of theological theory. The pastor shifts to highly practical Tuesday morning execution.
How do you actually walk this out in daily life?
Yes, how do you actually escape the curse of poverty practically?
And this transition relies on a very specific framework from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 10 through 12.
Right, it gives a 4-step roadmap for daily living.
The very first instruction the pastor highlights is, study to be quiet.
Which, on the surface, sounds like advice to just download a meditation app.
Yeah, just take some deep breaths. But the mechanism behind it is much deeper. He's talking about the absolute necessity of a calm, highly regulated mind.
Because if you look at the neuroscience of how humans operate, anxiety and external noise force the brain into survival mode.
You become reactionary.
Yes, you physically cannot engage the executive functions required for long-term strategic thinking when your mind is chaotic.
So a quiet mind is the prerequisite for rational planning.
Exactly. And he pairs this psychological quietness with a very pragmatic warning from Ecclesiastes 5.3 about literal quietness.
Meaning, basically, keeping your mouth shut.
Yeah. He warns the congregation not to talk prematurely about their business ideas or intellectual property.
Which is such good advice.
You share those plans only with your actual facilitators. Otherwise, competitors will steal your concepts before you even get off the ground.
It is incredibly pragmatic. And that leads right into step 2, which is a direct, almost blunt command from the text. Do your own business.
Mind your business.
Literally. He is telling the congregation to focus entirely on their own sphere of influence. Build your career path, start your enterprise, cultivate your specific value, and aggressively avoid getting tangled in other people's drama.
To illustrate this, he brings up Joseph and Daniel again.
Right. And what is vital to understand about these two biblical figures is that they were not visible, pulpit-pounding preachers.
Right. What does he call them? Undercover operators.
I love that phrase so much.
It perfectly describes their function. They were highly competent, elite administrators and problem solvers embedded within the secular palaces of foreign empires.
Egypt and Babylon.
Yeah. They utilized their exceptional business acumen to direct global economies from the inside out. Their overt religious visibility was minimal compared to their massive economic impact.
Which perfectly sets up step 3. Work with your own hands.
This is a mandate for extreme diligence. And the pastor issues a very stern, culturally relevant warning here to his congregation.
He specifically calls out 419 scams, right?
Yeah, the notorious advance fee frauds, along with embezzlement and tech-savvy theft.
He makes it unequivocally clear that attempting to cheat the system or relying on laziness does not lead to wealth.
It leads to modern-day slavery.
The way he redefines slave labor for the contemporary era is particularly striking here.
Right. He suggests that carrying massive balances on MasterCard and Visa is the modern equivalent of being a slave.
Which is a tough pill to swallow, but true. You are endlessly toiling month after month simply to service high-interest consumer debt rather than deploying your labor to create real compounding value for yourself.
Diligent hands build wealth. Lazy hands build debt.
Exactly. And the final step in the Thessalonians framework is walk honestly.
Meaning maintaining absolute ironclad integrity, especially with individuals outside the church community.
Yeah, the pastor humorously but pointedly tells them to pay their debts so their creditors aren't hunting them down in the church pews during Sunday service.
It gets a laugh, but the underlying principle is reputational capital.
It really is.
Yeah.
If you lack honesty, your ability to create and scale value stops immediately.
No legitimate institution will partner with you. No one will trust you to steward resources. Integrity is basically the friction reducer of all business.
You know, as I was analyzing this 4-step framework, it struck me how much it resembles the engineering process of building a skyscraper.
Oh, I like that. Break that down.
Well, that first step, studying to be quiet, that's the equivalent of digging the deep foundation. You have to do it underground in total silence where no one can even see the labor.
It isn't glamorous at all.
Not at all. But without it, anything you build on top will eventually collapse.
Precisely. And then working with your own hands and walking honestly, that is the process of bolting together the massive steel structural frame.
Yeah.
You need that unshakable integrity so the building can actually bear the immense weight of the wealth, the upper floors, without buckling under the pressure.
Because a weak character will absolutely crumble when real capital is applied to it.
That analogy perfectly bridges the gap between the internal preparation and the external result. But, we have to connect all of these practical steps back to the ultimate why of this entire deep dive.
Right, why go through all this effort?
Why go through the grueling process of digging that foundation? Why build the steel frame of integrity? Why acquire this wealth at all?
Well, the text from Thessalonians concludes by saying, so that you may lack nothing.
But looking at the broader context of the pastor's message, lacking nothing isn't just about personal comfort.
Not at all. The end goal of this theological and economic shift is to transform you into a vessel for massive societal change.
It is fundamentally not about an individual just being able to afford a private jet or vacation on a yacht off the Amalfi Coast.
Though, to be fair, he does humorously defend enjoying a yacht, if you've earned it honestly.
Oh, for sure. He definitely leaves room for enjoying the fruits of your labor. But the true target, the actual mission he's preaching, is exponentially larger than personal luxury.
The sermon is a clarion call to generate the sheer volume of capital required to build actual infrastructure.
We are talking about financing world-class schools to educate the next generation. We are talking about building state-of-the-art hospitals.
He specifically mentions the power generation infrastructure needed for true industrialization.
The ultimate vision is utilizing this wealth to build Africa, and specifically Nigeria, back into a robust global economic powerhouse.
It is about collective elevation, not just individual escape.
And that brings the core message right down to your daily reality.
Yeah, being truly well-informed on this topic means recognizing that the pursuit of knowledge, the cultivation of your personal value, and the subsequent acquisition of wealth, those are not endpoints.
They are merely the prerequisites for stewardship.
You are transitioning from someone who is just trying to survive the friction of a broken economic system into someone who generates so much value that it naturally overflows.
Altering the landscape for everyone around you.
The mandate is to become an architect of the very systems that a society relies on.
Which brings us full circle to that provocative concept of wealth transfer we discussed earlier.
Right, the vaults of the corrupt.
Exactly. We've explored how to reject the psychological hypnosis of poverty. We've traced the biblical blueprint that frames wealth as a neutral, necessary tool. And we've laid out the practical engineering of quiet diligence and honest business.
The foundational work has been completely outlined.
So I want to leave you with a lingering thought to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
Let's hear it.
If the underlying premise is true, if the wealth currently hoarded by corrupt systems is truly just waiting in a holding pattern to be transferred to those with the integrity to steward it, imagine you were handed that immense, world-altering capital tomorrow.
Wow.
What is the very first broken system in your own community that your diligent hands would start fixing?
That is the ultimate test of preparation, isn't it?
It really is. Something to carefully consider as you go about your week. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
Keep questioning the orthodoxies around you.
Keep learning, and above all, keep building your value.
Thank you for listening. To go deeper, watch the full message on YouTube or listen to the full-length sermon on Spotify. Follow the podcast, and please share it with someone who needs it and leave your response in the Q&A. Kindly keep your heart on fire, your eyes on Jesus, knowing you are the exception. Grace and peace. We love you deeply.